Welcome, fellow adventurers of the eerie and unexplored. My name is Christian Alexanderson, and this is Hemlocks to Hellbenders, a spine-chilling journey through Pennsylvania's haunted parks, ghostly forests, and spooky great outdoors. Okay, don't worry, I'm not going to do that Vincent Price impression thing the whole time. On this, the Halloween episode of the podcast, we're going to be exploring the many tales of ghosts, creatures, hauntings, cryptid sightings, unexplained phenomenon, legends, and folk tales that have a history in Pennsylvania's parks and forests. From the ghost sightings at Greenwood Furnace State Park to the Kecksburg UFO incident in Forbes State Forest, we're going to be hearing stories and sometimes first-hand accounts of frightening events from over the years. These sorts of stories have always held a special place in my heart. When I was a bored teenager looking to escape my dull suburban hometown, I'd load up my car with friends at night and go exploring. The latest copy of Weird New Jersey in hand, we go to cemeteries, abandoned hospitals, and all manner of supposedly haunted places looking for something, anything, that would scare us. That tradition, known as legend tripping, is as popular today as it was when I was growing up 20 years ago. Teenagers, and plenty of adults, are looking to stories of the past to fill their lives with a little bit of mystery. And in a place as big and as diverse as Pennsylvania, there's plenty of stories that'll make your hair stand up. Like the story of the mysterious violin that could be heard at Bull State Park, or the Civil War apparitions at Gettysburg, or the squonk sightings in the Pennsylvania wilds. They range from the curious to the creepy, from the macabre to the downright nightmarish. Whether you're a skeptic or a believer, these tales will leave you questioning the boundaries of reality and wondering what might be hiding just out of sight right here in Pennsylvania. So turn off the lights, get comfy, and prepare yourself for an odyssey into the unknown. Our guides for this journey are Brendan, Perry, and Nick, Pennsylvania. Brendan and Nick are the hosts of the Ghost Furnace podcast, which explores the paranormal, unexplained entities, and anomalies in and outside of the Commonwealth. Brendan, Nick, thanks so much for joining the program.
Thank you so much, Christian. We're really excited to be here tonight. I've been a fan for quite some time of Hemlocks to Hellbenders, and so it's kind of a bucket list interview to be able to talk to you tonight.
And Brendan has been telling me about the show for a while, so I have listened. But Brendan definitely is much more proactive on finding things. I am just busy running all around, but very happy to finally be able to sit down and talk with you.
Tell us about your podcast and what you talk about on it.
Oh, well, it's kind of interesting because Brendan and I actually had years ago, we did this thing called Dr. Pennsylvania, and it went on for a long time. And it was mostly just I was sitting in a car driving all about the Commonwealth, and I was going to senior centers and having coffee. I'm not senior rated myself, and I was just kind of collecting stories and stopping by towns and talking to people. And so we did this thing called Dr. Pennsylvania where we did a lot of history and folklore, and it was really research heavy. And I would do all this research, record in the middle of the night, and Brendan would do all the audio editing. And that just kind of fizzled out after a while because it was just really intensive research stuff. Really happy with a lot of the things that came out of that. But then, Brent and I have known each other for many years, and we've always had conversations with friends. One of our friends, Mike, wanted to do like a paranormal sort of thing. And so he got in touch with Brendan right away, and then he called me and he said, Nick, you don't believe in anything, so you'd be a great person to have on here. And I said, okay. But Mike, just because he was going through a lot of family things and work stuff, he ultimately decided, you know what, you two are just kind of better at talking. He comes on periodically, but that just kind of left Brendan and I after that kind of, there was a weird limbo period. Like, what do we want to do? And early on, we decided like we don't want to do anything that's going to require as much research as Dr. Pennsylvania did.
Yeah, and those are kind of famous last words because we decided to keep doing the paranormal stuff, and you think like, oh, how many stories can there be out there about ghosts or cryptids or UFOs? And we found out very quickly there are lots and lots of stories. We'd always been interested in reading about these things, but once you start kind of digging into them, you just find kind of more and more. So that's kind of what we focused on is, ghosts, cryptids, folklore, UFOs, high strangeness, all kind of in the context of history and culture. We interview experiencers, we interview investigators, authors, folklorists, and just kind of talk about our own experiences, our own thoughts on some of these things.
Yeah, and even though a lot of the things we talk about are Pennsylvania related, we're really not as exclusive to Pennsylvania like Dr. Pennsylvania obviously was. However, because of that's where we are at, and also because we have spent our lifetimes collecting a lot of the stories that we talk about and the opinions that we have and parallels that we draw from, it is fairly Pennsylvania centric at times.
What originally got you interested in these sorts of stories?
So a lot of it really started for us just with not only necessarily our own experiences, because we both have had some weird things happen. Um, but a lot of it was people around us having experiences. Um, and I don't know if that just comes with being artists involved in music and filmmaking and other things, but you just run across a lot of different types of people and you start hearing different types of stories. And I think when I was young, I thought that the only people that saw UFOs were farmers in fields over in Iowa. um or the only people that saw Bigfoot were people living down by the river in a van. um and you find out very quickly that all these kind of strange experiences come from all different walks of life and in all different types of places. um and so that kind of just like the ubiquity of all this stuff really made it seem much more accessible than what I ever thought. And again, once you start talking about and getting into it, you end up becoming more interested. And kind of some of the stuff we're going to talk about tonight, a lot of it is very much about going out into the world and experiencing things and learning more about what's around us and the mystery of it all.
Yeah, and I would say I was the reader kid. I moved around a lot when I was really young. I learned to read really young. And I think a lot of people that are of that mentality, of that personality type, tend to gravitate towards history and storytelling. And to me, great history, really digestible history, was on the strength of the storytelling. And one thing leads to another, and I've often said that the people that are really interested in, say, paranormal stuff tend to be people that are also really invested in the love of history, because I think they go hand in glove. Because it's like I have periods of time and people in history I'm fascinated by, and it's almost like I still drive around PA constantly, we were talking beforehand. And I feel like I'm constantly saying goodbye to things or trying not to part with things. And I think that you could see a parallel where the love of history and the love of historical figure comes to a desire to hope that they're kind of there and don't have to ever go away.
Can you guys tell me what legend tripping is?
Yeah, so legend tripping, and this is something where I think a lot of folks out there might not know this term, but they're probably very used to the act. So legend tripping is how a lot of people get into different paranormal stories to begin with. It's almost like an informal version of investigations. It usually takes the guise of um, kids hopping into a car late at night, driving out to a spooky stretch of road, a crybaby bridge, a haunted cemetery, and basically trying to experience paranormal activity. That's what's different from like a lot of other research and formal investigations. Now, that's obviously not just teenagers going and do that. You have a lot of people that go out places and think, oh, there's this weird building over here. There's something going on over here. Apparently, I've heard stories of, a strange shadow in those woods. And it gets people out there and physically trying to actually have experiences. So that's why it's a little different than like regular investigations, but it's what gets people out there a lot of times, especially early on.
Yeah, and I think that's just part of growing up. I think it just has to be. Like, even if it's not a reality for everybody, I just feel it's so deeply American and something that we love to do, but it's not. It's worldwide. There's people all over
Right.
the place who want to find these cool local legends. Like we were talking about earlier before the podcast. I went to the Gravity Hills. I went to the cemeteries, and I went to the quote unquote, mental institutions that were closed down because they killed too many people. And there's, all these amazing stories that I grew up with in New Jersey is the exact same thing my friends grew up with in West Virginia, the same things my wife grew up with in Ohio.
Yeah, I don't think you can apply as a municipality for a zip code until you have the haunted house.
Yeah, yeah.
And so I think that you're absolutely right. There is very much a character that every town has that haunted house, and at the very least, you were aware of it. But it really is a way that in which we engage as a community.
And I've never met anybody that really likes their hometown enough to say that there's tons to do there. So no matter what, there's always something to do because you're always driving somewhere.
Absolutely. Well said. Yeah. We always say every town has an Elm Street, you know?
Yeah, yeah.
So,
Well, let's get into some of these legends and stories and pretty cool tales. The Snyder Cemetery at Moraine State Park has been the site of some interesting paranormal activity. Can you tell us about them?
Yeah, and in fact, I can tell you about how I became aware of it because both Brendan and I live not very far from there. Like we could walk there. It would take a full day, but we could do it if we, weren't, who we are. But actually, it was a friend of ours while we were in high school that said they had seen a TV program that reportedly said it was the most haunted place they had ever been to. However, I have not been able to locate what that program was. I've never seen any program. I looked in earnest for some time. So around 2003, we were turned on to it and we were trying to find it, but it was a lot more difficult to access at that time because you know, we're still using MapQuest and everything, and it really wasn't a labeled thing. So we had a lot of false starts, but eventually we were able to find it. It is in the vicinity of Lake Arthur Moraine State Park, and it's much better known now, and it's more cared for at this time. But the very brief story is there was a Conrad Snyder who immigrated to the United States at really the dawn of the Republic. He came over, I think, in 1789, give or take a few years there from Switzerland. He ended up being one of the people, or maybe it was one of his children, who established the Bar Association, the lawyers in Butler County, Pennsylvania. And he was a professional trapper and farmer, this Conrad Snyder, and the township in which the cemetery is most of what were his lands. So the family plot is down a hill from where the original farmhouse stood, and it is this wonderfully oblique black sandstone walled area with a cast iron gate which had rotted away, and it is demarcated from the dirt road of which it's off of by two black sandstone obelisks. I believe one of them is broken. And it's a fascinating place because it sits in this little hollow. There's hills all around it. The lake laps up just 20 yards on the other side, and had some personal things there, had some things happen with friends. I remember walking around the area and finding an old like drainage ditch and finding a cluster gauge from a Model T. That was a pretty cool find. It's not very paranormal, but very cool. But probably one of the most common stories, and then I'll share with you something that happened to friends of ours. Very common stories involve red eyes chasing people out of there. Now, of course, red-eyed creatures are common enough in various stories such as this, but these eyes do not have owners. They are just, wandering about on their own, some chasing people down. But there are also stories that Conrad Snyder's hunting dogs are also heard moving about. So, not long after we actually found where the cemetery was, a few friends and I went out there, and it was kind of weird. We were in our friend's. He had an SUV that had one of the early temp gauges on it, and it was a summer night. The temperature registered like 15 degrees cooler when we got back. And when we stepped out, we had rolled all the windows down because there's many stories of people getting locked out of their vehicle at the location, having to break a window. We didn't want to do that, so we kept the windows down and we even kept a door open. We didn't stick around there for very long. Not much happened, but when we got in the car and saw the temp thing, we thought that was very weird. And it didn't get back up to normal, which was around, it was a hot summer night, so it was probably like 70 degrees. Didn't get back up there until we were 2 miles and back on the old two-lane highway. Now, about a month later, because we had just found this place and we've heard all these stories, so now we're going to be going up there frequently. That same friend in that same vehicle took two other guys up with him. I was out running that night. I used to go running in the middle of the night. And I remember distinctly, it was a very still night. There wasn't a lot of wind. It was kind of muggy out, ideal running conditions. So I end up getting home around 2 in the morning from my run, and I'm in my basement. I just turned on the TV, and three guys come running in, and they are still shaking, like visibly shaking. These are not those guys. Well, their story was they had gone out to the cemetery, and it was very dark. They had turned the headlights towards the cemetery, and they were hanging out around it. They decided to walk inside the walled area, but because the way the headlights were, they couldn't see anything below chest height because it was just a black abyss because the headlights cut clean across it. One of our friends, Art, while trying to light a lighter, bumped into something and it fell over. They get the lighter going. They realize he had accidentally knocked over a tombstone. It wasn't an intentional vandal. They're trying to set it up when the wind picks up. And they start hearing running coming up from up on the hilltop where the farm had been. They hear the dry leaves. This is like June, May, June. And they ended up running and jumping the wall, getting back into the car. It was an Explorer, and driving away. Now, the weird things about it is there was, like I said, it was a very still night. So the wind was not present. And again, these are friends of ours that, were familiar with woods. It was something running towards them. They were all very adamant about it. And they were all legitimately shaken up. So that is Snyder Cemetery. Unfortunately, it had been vandalized at some point as it became more well known. And that's a shame, but thankfully some people have been taking some care of it. I personally haven't been there in many years, but it's quite the story. And I still distinctly remember the look on their faces. It was very legitimate. These are guys I had known for years. And I definitely believe what happened. Now, what was running towards them, I don't know. I don't know how much their imagination was carrying with them, but it was a very weird story indeed.
Yeah, and is there anything more terrifying than just hearing something run at you in the night?
Right. Yeah, it's very, very unnerving, even if you like to consider yourself a woodsman and familiar with the sounds of the woods.
There's been some spooky happenings at the covered bridge at McConnell's Mill State Park. Can you tell us about your experience there?
Yeah, so when it comes to McConnell's Mill State Park, it's interesting because this is another it's very near Moraine. It's actually managed by the same state park service out of the same offices. Um, and just like Moraine, it has a very kind of interesting history. There's a grist mill there that was active for a long time, and it has a very picturesque covered bridge, um, which is something that lots of people go there, take photos of, and almost everyone in the area knows about it. And there's a very particular fall there on Slippery Rock Creek that a lot of kayakers and hikers and fishermen know is extremely dangerous. Unfortunately, this is one of those parks where if people aren't safe, there have been tragedies there over the years.
I would say almost every year there's one. It's one of the few waters when we fish we don't wade in.
Right. And so like I think this is probably a good time to say that, when it comes to legend tripping or doing any of this stuff, please everyone be safe if you are investigating these things. Don't do anything that is, illegal. Do not trespass. If the park is closed, don't go there. Um But this particular road that goes over the covered bridge is actually, even though it's on the park property, it's still a township road, so it's open to get back to a bunch of houses and everything in the other county. um and so, like a lot of kids, we heard that that covered bridge was haunted because it's a picturesque covered bridge. Why wouldn't it be haunted, as we always say? um and so when what you're supposed to do is, when you get there to the covered bridge, you're supposed to turn off your vehicle when you're stopped on the bridge. It's a little one-lane covered bridge. You're supposed to turn the car off, turn the lights off, honk 3 times, and some mysterious woman in white who perished in the creek some untold years ago is supposed to show up there. So whenever I was there with some of my friends, and this is like, again, early on in high school, we weren't even there that late at night. Like, it was like 10 o'clock, but it was in the winter, so it had been dark for a few hours, so it probably felt like a whole lot later. um we weren't actually that adventurous when we were younger. um but so we had down there and everything, and so we do this ritual. You turn the car off, you honk 3 times, and you're supposed to look in the rear view mirror and see them. So we did that. Nothing happened, and we're, of course, like, oh, like, I guess there is no ghost. Well, my buddy who I was with could not get his car started again. um Now, me and the other passengers found out later that this was not an uncommon occurrence for this old Buick. Sometimes we just turned it off. The alternator just was a little janky and didn't start back up. But it resulted in a few minutes of, like, legitimate panic. you know and so it's one of those experiences that you remember, that you do end up remembering. Now, I think that that same story that we thought was unique to that covered bridge, McConnell's Mills, there's bridges all over the state, all over the country, and all over the world that have that exact same format. Um, and like a lot of things, it's the going and the doing that's, like, really, like, the fun adventure. Like, so yeah, we didn't have a paranormal experience, but it was still an experience that we all remember. At the very least, it was a beautiful drive through a wonderful park in the evening. you know
Yeah, plus you got spooked out regardless.
oh yeah, that always happens. It seems like I am not a brave soul.
No.
It's easy.
I didn't mean to agree to that so quickly, but funny enough, our friend Mike, who started us on doing this, he lived with his wife. Her family had a farmhouse in the park itself, or right along the borders. And that place was so spooky because there was not a straight line in the house. It was like walking through a fun house, and that place was unsettling in the middle of the day. I think that's actually the scarier feature of the park, was that house they lived in.
Well, speaking of, like, ghost sightings, Greenwood Furnace State Park has also experienced some ghost sightings. Can you tell us about the lady in white?
Yeah, so this is along the same lines. You guys are gonna hear this story and think, oh, this sounds familiar, because a lady in white is one of the most common things that people report when they talk about haunted locations. Right up there with, shadow people and creepy little kids. Um, but so Greenwood Furnace State Park, excuse me. It's just down there in Huntington County, just kind of south of State College. And as anyone knows, like, the iron and coke furnaces that are in part of Pennsylvania's history there's a lot of parks that are built around them. Um, and there's usually a small town associated with it, and Greenwood has some old structures that are from that town. One of those areas is a blacksmith shop, and this blacksmith shop was owned by one of the prominent families in the town, who owned, I believe they owned, like, a drugstore slash general store and a few other locations. Um, but even nowadays, you have some of the environmental education specialists as well as visitors who have reported seeing a lady in white at this blacksmith shop. And a lot of people are probably thinking, "Oh, that's a weird place for, a lady in white to be a blacksmith shop." Um, but the story goes that she actually died in this building, as a jilted lover, and is haunting this location, to the point where they actually do ghost tours, or at least did ghost tours for a period of time. I'm sure they probably still do. And there's also not just that. There's also a man in a suit that apparently shows up that people see that shouldn't be there. There's a small boy, particularly wearing an all blue outfit, and an Irish setter dog. So there are 4 different apparitions that show up at this place, which, like, and again, this is when we talk about how these stories get weirder the more you look into it. Like, a lady in white at a spooky place is like, okay, that's one thing. But that's 4 different apparitions that have been reported by multiple people over the years. And I looked into this when I first heard about the story and couldn't find an actual death record of this woman. Her name was supposed to be Anna Monsell, excuse me, and couldn't actually find the death record. But because this is from back in the 1880s, some of those records are not as easy to find nowadays as they used to be. But people are having these experiences at a historic site while giving tours. There's also in the blacksmith shop, people say they can hear the anvil being struck whenever no one is in there. And there's even park staff, not to like dox anybody, but there are park staff that are reported hearing those sounds, going and checking because they assume someone is messing with the historical props, and no one's in there. But when they touch the anvil, they can feel the anvil still vibrating, which is unsettling.
So the bottom line is, if you can only visit one haunted Pennsylvania park, this is the one to go. Like, you're really bound to get your money's worth.
Right, right.
Bang for your buck. I mean, there might not be anything better.
Right. And I think this is a great example too of, like, you have these historic buildings in parks all over the state, and like I said, all over the country. A lot of them do have similar stories attached to them. And regardless of what people kind of believe in, if you go there and ask some of these, volunteers or the park staff about them, whether or not they have a personal story or not, they're probably A, going to know about it, and B, it's going to give them the opportunity to give you some other information about the park. So, like, either way, it's probably going to be a good experience for you.
What can you tell us about the mysterious violin in the woods at Ole Bull State Park?
So first, you have to learn who Ole Bull is. Now, Ole Bull was one of the greatest, arguably one of the greatest violinists of all time, but certainly of his era. And he was a contemporary of Paganini. And in fact, at the time, there was something of a rivalry going on. I mean, Ole Bull would famously, for violinists, he, would sand his bridge flatter so he could chord. The chord being a minimum of 3 notes or more played in accord, in accordance with one another, harmonizing, which Paganini didn't do, and that was his reasoning. But he was from what is now Norway. At that time was ruled by the Danes, I believe. He had established briefly an independent Norwegian settlement in Pennsylvania's northern tier, around where Ole Bull State Park is. Recently experienced some really significant flooding. This is in Pennsylvania's Potter County now. My father, his friend, and I have a camp out that way, just down the road. So Ole Bull he is still regarded as a national hero figure in Norway, still very well regarded by classical violinists, and was possibly the inspiration for Peer Gynt in part. But he did not actually live in Pennsylvania very long. But if you're going to have a haunted figure in Ole Bull State Park, you're going to have the most famous person that lived there. And so that's what it is. So I think this is one of those cases where it's people who really are in love with the history of the area, because when you're up there, you might not understand, like, oh, there was a time when there was hope that this would become such a bustling place. But when you look out, and this is not far from the Dark Park, Cherry State Park, which is a plateau where stargazers often go because there's so little light pollution in this area. And I told you before we started, this region wasn't even fully mapped out until the 1920s. So I don't think people realize how desolate it can really be. You look out from that plateau all around the region, and it could be any century in the last 10,000. It's really kind of remarkable place. So I think this is one of those things where people want to remember. They want people to know that there was this man. And so his dulcet tunes are going through the forest.
Yeah, and I think that like you put yourself in that setting and you have folks that say that they hear his violin playing in in the hollows of that park, and you almost like can't blame them, for hearing that stuff, because it's such a it's such a right place for that kind of activity. And like you said, Nick, that could really be anywhere at any time. And you're so you're in such a liminal space at that point that I can only imagine what it's like to hear that, because we've collected stories from other parks where people have heard drums in the woods, and like that's kind of like that could be seen as like an aggressive or kind of creepy thing, but with the violin almost singing like a sad song, like that's just a completely different vibe than what you normally hear with these kind of stories. That's why I think that the Ole Bull one sticks with me so much.
Well, and the other aspect too is, like I said, when you're standing up on that plateau, or if you're walking through the Hammersley Wilderness area, you feel like it could be any time because the forests are so dense, so mossy, lush. The streams, these are cold water sources that run through them, are beautiful and trout laden. And you forget that it wasn't that long ago that the place was a lunar landscape. When our cabin was built, this was 1906. There was hardly timber standing because this was all clear cut area. And so the forest that we see today is really less than 80 years old because most of the towns in that region were and did on occasion burn down because we were in a period known in Pennsylvania, mostly known to northern Pennsylvanians as the brush heap era, of which many grandparents in the region remember. And that was where the trees weren't. It was just a bunch of brush, and it was very prone to wildfire.
Yeah, that's one of the things that we covered in a recent episode all about the Pennsylvania Lumber Museum, is that after everyone came in and clear cut Pennsylvania, flooding, wildfires, it's just what had to happen because the landscape was just so devastated. And to go back, one of the interesting things is when I started visiting state parks, I knew virtually nothing about them. When I arrived at Ole Bull State Park, I thought it was Old Bull,
Sure.
like a nickname, like Old Bull. And then so I go there, and they're like, no, it's this world acclaimed violinist who created a colony called New Norway. And
Yes.
I am Norwegian, last name Alexanderson, very Norwegian. And I show up, and the people of the park are just so phenomenal and being able to tell you about the history of like, oh yeah, I came in here to run my mile and see another state park and blah blah blah. But you stay there for a couple minutes, and especially when you talk to these park staff, you just learn so much.
Yeah, and I should real quick go. There were several key industries in Pennsylvania, and prior to the lumber, there was the iron furnaces. That I mean, we're the ghost furnace based on the imagery of these iron furnaces because they are these great stone pyramids that are just in the woods, and they acne the landscape, particularly in this region. So that was the fur trade was a big industry. The iron was a big industry. Tanneries,
Yeah,
when you get into northern PA in particular, because of the types of trees that we have, tanneries were a big thing. And now you're sending woodhicks. The lumberjacks in this area were known as woodhicks. You're sending them out. So now we have, well, now we're going to start cutting the other trees. So they start clear cutting. The lumber industry is massive. And then, of course, you have the birth of the modern oil industry being out in Crawford, Venango County areas out here in western, northwestern Pennsylvania.
Oil Creek State Park.
Yeah, those are really the industries that drove Pennsylvania, especially the Pennsylvanian interior and the northern tier for so many years. And each of those industries has their separate sets of lore.
And I think one of those things that isn't mentioned enough is the colliding of different cultures. You have people from everywhere coming to Pennsylvania, working the lumber industry, tanning, trapping, doing everything. You're having Germans, Scots, Canadians, Norwegians, everyone coming here and everyone working together. And then all of a sudden, they bring their folklore. Then they see something. And then that's how you build upon, and that's how you get these, a lot of these great stories.
Absolutely. And I think that that's what makes this whole area, I mean, the whole state really, so ripe for both folklore, but the paranormal stories that kind of come out of it, and the intertwining of the history. And again, when you learn about one thing, it just leads to more stories. And real quick, I have to shout out to the PA Lumber Museum. Like, I haven't actually listened to that episode yet, but if you're anywhere near Route 6, up in that area, stop at the PA Lumber Museum. I went there because I thought it would be a fun way to spend a rainy day in Potter County. And like 3 hours later, I was like, this is the darn best museum north of the Heinz History Center. Like, what is going on here? It's a wonderful place. I just had to say that real quick.
And Route 6 itself is routinely regarded as one of the most beautiful roads in the country, particularly in autumn.
Right. And not to completely shift topics, but there was actually I know, famous last words, but there was actually a Bigfoot road crossing right at the bottom of the hill there next to Denton Run back in 1992 that was seen by, I think, 6 different motorists at the same time.
Yeah, so many Bigfoot were getting hit in that area that they had to put the Bigfoot crossing sign up.
Right.
Thank God. And luckily we haven't hit one since.
Right.
So that's
Yeah.
great.
Yeah. Good for everybody. But
Blue Knob State Park has a memorial for the lost children of the Alleghenies. What do you know about the incident and paranormal activities that occurred years later?
Well, I can speak some. I've forgotten so much about that story. We did actually a Dr. Pennsylvania on it. It was one of our more listened to episodes. And the very, very short story is that cabin in the hillside, very rural, 1850s, I want to say the era. Father hears meat running up a tree. He hears his dog going out, so he thinks it's, dinner, and wastes not. So he runs out with his gun. The wife is working in the garden. The kids were to stay on the grounds. They end up, it's presumed that they went following the father. They get lost. Massive hunts going on for them. There's stories. In that episode we did, I read a lot of contemporary periodicals I was able to access, and they talked about setting big bonfires in the forest in the night, hoping that the children would see it and come. I forget for how long the children were being searched for, but on the other side of a hill or a couple hills over, a neighbor essentially had a dream about the location of the children, and it was very specific. They were to follow a creek, they would find a dead deer, and not far from the deer they would find an article of one of the children's clothing, and then in the roots of birch trees along the creek where the creek had eroded away the soil, they would find the children. That was the dream that was documented at that time. And that indeed is where they found the children. I think it was the day after that dream was shared. Like one of the members of the household.
Yeah,
2 days
sorry.
after.
Yeah,
Thank you.
it was 2 days after Jacob Dilbert first talked to his wife, then his brother, and whenever he kept having the dream, I think for 2 or 3 consecutive nights. And when he finally wanted to go look, he was actually apparently worried that like they were going to think there was foul play involved, because he's like, this doesn't make any, because he wasn't someone who had a history of like clairvoyance or like having prophetic dreams. He was just a normal farmer, in Pavia, Pennsylvania, but yeah, unfortunately that's where they did find the 2 boys, Joseph and Daniel Cox, that were 5 and 7 respectively. And so I mean, it was a really tragic thing that happened.
Huge news.
Right. Yeah. Huge news. And it was really, really sad. And but from a contemporary standpoint, there were people who said like, oh yeah, it's kind of weird, this guy had a dream and then found the bodies. But but folks, like, that wasn't the biggest part of the story. It was that these poor kids died. But looking back on it, it has this interesting paranormal element where it's like, that's really strange.
Yeah, it's almost an archetypical story now
Hmm.
because you, of course, hear so many supposed psychics saying, "Well, I have this dream, and then and it yields nothing." This is particularly interesting, and you can find that episode, Dr. Pennsylvania. It's because we made a big point of reading from the periodicals and that because we don't always have access to so much contemporary stuff from that era. And fortunately, we did. It is a very sad story, but it is very peculiar at the same time.
Gettysburg is known as one of the most haunted places in the United States. What kind of ghost stories are popular from the town and battlefield? And do you have any personal experience there?
Yeah, so Gettysburg National Military Park is widely regarded as one of the most haunted places, at least in the country. Um, and it has the, kind of cottage industry to back it up now. Um, and really it's kind of like the Super Bowl for paranormal investigators, I feel like. And it's because there is so much that happens there from a paranormal standpoint. Um, I'd say some of the most common things you hear about are kind of what are called disembodied sounds, where people hear just the sounds of battle, even though nothing can be seen. You hear that reported all the time by people. Uh, the second biggest one I'd say is probably battlefield apparitions, which is where people see what they assume are reenactors, and then they find out after talking to rangers that there are no reenactors in that area. Um, and those are so common that it's almost comical, like, because it just happens so often. Um, Now, outside of the battlefield, one of the most haunted locations is called the Jenny Wade House, which is a really interesting point of history because she's the only civilian casualty directly from the battle. She was hit with a stray bullet and died in front of her sink, basically. Um, Now, one of our early episodes of this show, we actually played what's called an EVP, which is an electronic voice phenomena that one of our friends caught while staying at the Jenny Wade house one night, because you can actually stay there overnight, which again I would not be brave enough to do, but our friends did, and it's one of those things where I feel that people go there very much primed looking for ghost stuff because there's no way to get away from it. It's not a place where you're gonna be like, oh, is there some ghost stories around here? Um, but there's something for everybody when it comes to the types of activity. One of my favorite ones that you hear a lot is of the time slip in the hospital. So this actually happened at one of the dorms at Gettysburg College. It's just called Old Dorm. It's now an administrative building. Um, but there's this famous story of two women who were working on the fourth floor, and they're just I can't remember what their actual jobs were, but they worked at the school, and they were taking the elevator down from the fourth floor, and the elevator hit the first floor and kept going into the basement. Anyone who's worked in old buildings know that old elevators sometimes just kind of keep going, and that's not necessarily all that terribly unusual. um, but they get to the bottom floor and the doors open, and instead of seeing the furnace room, what they see is a Civil War battle hospital. And there are people screaming in agony. There are nurses and doctors running all over the place. You see people carrying men on stretchers, and these two women, rightfully so, freak out. They start screaming, trying to get the door to close. And they both say that there's one man who made eye contact with them who looked just as confused as they were. And they eventually get the door to close. They get back to the first floor. They freak out, obviously. They tell people, they go down and check, and obviously there's nothing there. And this is one of those stories. The reason I think it captivates people is because what it points to is not so much that these people saw the ghost of a Civil War hospital, but there was some sort of a time slip where they actually were looking into the Civil War hospital.
Yeah.
And you almost have to wonder what that poor soldier who made eye contact with them was thinking, seeing, because if you saw someone in garb from 150 years in the future, you'd like know what they were. It wouldn't be like looking at someone from, that's from another planet, but it would be enough that you'd be confused,
Sure. Yeah.
And it's one of those stories where that element of it, I think, for a lot of people rings true and makes it creepier, because like if you're going to make up a story about a college, about Gettysburg College, like that's not the one you would make up almost. So it's just, that's one of my favorite stories from Gettysburg.
I really wish I'd asked or called my uncle beforehand, because my uncle, before moving on to graduate studies, he did his undergrad at Gettysburg. And I remember he had a story, but I can't remember it for the life of me right now. But as the personal experience, yeah, actually, when my wife and I were on honeymoon, we were coming back, we went up into the Adirondacks, and we were driving just the old blue highways, the old two-laners, and seeing really cool stuff, and found some lovely towns that we've revisited since. But on our loop back around, we spent an evening in Gettysburg, and we got there right before lunch, and we started touring the battlefields. And there is the site where the first like major casualty, like an officer, was shot and killed, and I cannot remember who it was, but the site is essentially in town. At least that's how my memory is of it. What is not in dispute, though, is we had a camera with us, an early SLR camera, batteries, 4 of them, double A's, and we hadn't used the camera all that much. The batteries were brand new, and it kept shutting off right there. So we just figured, well, these batteries must not be that good. We went towards some other place, not thinking about it. We were at other sites just an hour later and turned the camera on. Everything's working fine. There was no more issues with it. We still had a couple more days where we were out driving around and used it periodically, had it on, and never an issue again. So not a very dramatic story, but definitely the sort of story, the sort of thing that people are always saying is happening. Batteries drain, electronics don't work. We didn't have anything beyond that. And in the immediate moment, we didn't think anything of it. It was only after we realized, hey, we've been using this camera a bit, and we haven't had we only had problems there. It's not like we changed the batteries. So that's the closest thing to anything real weird in Gettysburg I've had happen.
And now, let's hear from our sponsors. The Keystone Trails Association is hosting a 4-day wilderness advanced first aid course from November 7th to 10th in Halifax, PA. This class teaches essential life-saving skills, patient assessment, field care for injuries and illnesses, managing environmental conditions, and proper reporting for rescue assistance. This event is ideal for outdoor enthusiasts and group leaders. Sign up today at kta-hike.org. Are you looking for your next adventure? Unlock some of the best landscapes in Pennsylvania with incredibly detailed, highly curated waterproof trail maps from the folks at Purple Lizard. They create extraordinary maps of Pennsylvania State Forest for people who love to explore the outdoors. Find them at your local outfitters, bike shops, and bookstores, or visit purplelizard.com, where your next adventure begins. The Pennsylvania Parks and Forest Foundation is celebrating their 25th anniversary. Since 1999, they remain a cornerstone in supporting state parks and forests by creating accessibility and diversity opportunities, restoring habitats, providing educational opportunities, engaging in advocacy, and promoting the health benefits of being outdoors. In 2007, they started to record successes. They and their 46 chapters have since logged over 680,000 volunteer hours and completed more than 2,000 service projects. The work of the foundation and its friends groups could not exist without you. Thank you for being a part of a legacy of conservation for the future of Pennsylvania state parks and forests. To join their mission or to download resources for exploring state parks and forests, visit them online at paparksandforests.org. All right, back to the show. Well, let me ask your opinion. If somebody comes to you, a friend, family member, coworker, and tells you one of these stories, what do you think is the most appropriate way to react to it?
So, we do get this a lot. I had a call on Tuesday from someone who had experience Um, something we tell everybody is that like one, you believe people. Like I believe people are having these experiences, and I believe that their feelings and their reactions are absolutely real. Um, that even if you are on the skeptical side of things, if someone's trusting you enough to come to you with something that has affected them, you should listen, and you should let them get it out first. But then you kind of put on your at least me and Nick tend to put on our uh mechanic's hat, where it's like, okay, well, let's see what might actually be going on here. And a lot of times if you ask a few questions, you start to find out that the stories are usually deeper and have more going on than what you initially anticipate. There's usually context that really helps. Um, Now, like Nick had mentioned with this story in Gettysburg with the batteries draining, like that in itself isn't necessarily all that terribly weird. But Nick's wife is a photographer. She knows cameras. She knows I'm a photographer too. Like how the batteries should normally operate. So that's another thing that makes it a little strange. The fact that it's in Gettysburg, which is notoriously haunted, also makes it a little strange. The fact that it happened near a prominent site where people are going all the time. We tend to see that a lot, where places that get more attention tend to have more of this activity happening. So that's another kind of strike in the, again, it doesn't say necessarily what's happening, but it kind of lines up with what you would expect to be happening in those areas. And um and I think that, again, that's not to say they either had or didn't have that experience, but it might point us towards maybe what's going on.
Yeah, it's hard for me as somebody who's always skeptical. It's hard for me to just be like, yes, yes, you definitely saw that, and all of those things are real, and I agree with you. I went on a ghost tour in Gettysburg with some content creator friends of mine, and the guy was great. He was, soldiers were standing here, and shots were fired, and a person felt this horrible pang, and oh, there's apparitions, and there's lights that do this and do that, and as badly and deeply as I want to be like, that's so awesome. Yes, I'm all in. And he's showing photos from his phone, and you wouldn't believe this. The only thing I feel deep down is it was a reflection. It's not that big of a deal. And I wish I wasn't. I deeply wish I could just be like, oh yeah, absolutely. And this is a person who's gone to places and felt very weird things, and then immediately came back and like, yep, I was just freaking out. Nothing real was going on.
No, I'm much more in line with your thinking here. I mean, I do believe that there's the potential for some things. I could be persuaded, but it's like anything, any human creation of art, most of it isn't going to move you. The more you love something too, the more you hate the vast majority of it. Like I had a conversation with my wife the other day where I said, I probably hate 90% of all music. Do I really love music or do I really not like music? But it's one of those things. I really do care about these stories. And if a friend came to me, as I said, an earlier story I shared this evening, I I am with Brendan in the sense that like I really do believe that something has shaken you up. I don't know if I'm willing to accept that your breath that you caught on camera is evidence of a ghost or this dust floating around is a sentient orb.
Right, absolutely. And I think that like in cases like that, it's because like for people like me and Nick, like we do care about this stuff in the sense that we're passionate about it, we read about it, we talk about it with you and your listeners. Um, and if we think that it is important and it does tell us things about the world around us and about our culture and about our history, then being not critical of it, but by looking at it a few layers deeper is warranted, I think, a lot of times. So like I know we at our show have gotten um we've gotten criticisms from for being a little too hard on some of our ghost hunting friends. And I think the reason we come off that way sometimes is because we do care about it, and we do want the integrity to be there. So it's not like we're never critical, but at the same time, like you said, Christian, uh, you do just kind of freak out sometimes, and that's okay too. That's part of the experience.
Sure.
Yeah, with the modern ghost hunter, okay, I really care about whether things are true and real. And I have a lot of respect for people that are trying to make a scientific endeavor of searching for these things. I don't think that's time wasted. However, I do think there are a lot of people that are much too eager to say something is and not critically examine that further. And I think that's where I'm coming from a lot of the time.
Yeah, I think anyone who's sure of anything it has to be questioned a little bit.
Exactly.
The Pennsylvania wilds has been home to a number of stories about creatures. Can you tell me what a hoop snake is?
This is Brendan's favorite thing.
Boy, I've been waiting so long for you to ask me that question, Christian. So I'm just gonna read a brief excerpt on a story from this is from Flatlanders and Ridge Runners. This is by James York Glim, who, if you're into PA folklore, look up this book. It's one of the ones you should have in your library.
He was a professor up at Mansfield. He was an English professor, so already after my own heart. But he was also a pretty solid old-time banjo player, too. Sadly, he is no longer with us. There is an old-time radio program that has promised to send me tapes of his playing that were recorded in the field. I've yet to receive them. Bill, I will be asking for those again.
So when it comes to hoop snakes, this is what falls into the category of what are often looked at as tall tales. When we talk about like Bigfoot and cryptids, a lot of people put those as like things that are out there that may or may not be actual creatures. Hoop snakes definitely do not exist. It's a tall tale. But these are the things that we mentioned earlier about like to tell us things about our culture. And like you mentioned, Christian, come from other places from all over the world. And I just love the idea of, French lumberjacks in the northern tier talking about hoop snakes after their day of work. So I'm just going to read you this brief entry on hoop snakes that James York Glim was able to get. So this lumberjack says, you don't see a lot of them nowadays, but there used to be enough of them around. About 8 feet long and came in 3 colors: orange, green, or yellow with blue dots. Color depending on the kind of whiskey the storyteller had been drinking. Anyway, they had this barb or stinger on the end of their tail with the deadliest poison in it. Why, if a hoop snake stung the back of an old oak tree, the leaves would turn brown and the tree would die right there on the spot. Of course, when they got mad, the hoop snakes would just roll up in a hoop like the wheel of a bike. They'd be taken just by taking the barb in their mouth. They'd come rolling right after you the same way. Well, one day this farmer is out tilling his field when he looks down on a row of corn and there's one rolling right at him. He's so scared he can't move, and all he's got between him is him and his shovel. When the hoop snake unrolls and comes flying at him like a spear, the farmer holds up the handle and the barb sticks right into it. Well, the farmer dropped the shovel and just ran home. He came back around dusk very carefully. There was the hoop snake lying dead with its barb still in the shovel handle. Now the poison was all drained out of the snake, but the shovel handle had swelled to the size of a huge log. The farmer hauled the log down to the sawmill and had it cut into planks, beams, and boards, built his whole house out of that wood. Then it rained so hard, trout were swimming by the windows. The farmer woke up in the morning and all wet, with no roof over his head at all, just a lot of little toothpicks all around him. Seemed the rain had washed all the poison out of the logs. They just shrunk back to nothing.
I'm so on board with this.
It's a great story. And the oldest reference we've been able to find, and we've asked another folklorist about this, the oldest reference we've been able to find to date is actually a Pennsylvania tale too. It is in Philip Tome's 30 Years a Hunter. Philip Tome was one of the first permanent European American of European ancestry to actually settle up in that northern tier late 18th into the mid 19th century, and he is buried not but a few yards from what is presumably Corn Planter, one of the last Seneca Confederacy chiefs up in that area. So interesting all around. But yeah, hoop snakes, I have no idea why that is such a continued fascinating, but I do love the conceit in the very beginning that their coloration is very much determined upon what the person was drinking before telling the story.
I take back what I said earlier. I'm all in. This is. I mean, tall tale or not, this is great. Just the visual aspects of it, the storytelling, how terrifying it would be if it was real. I'm all in.
Right. Yeah, it's just one of those things that just clicks with you. And that's why I think if you read enough of these stories, certain things just kind of resonate. And if it's okay, I want to talk about another creature that falls into that category that I actually want to hear some of your thoughts on, Christian, because you were just at a festival that talked about this creature. So something that falls in the same category is the squonk. So I'm going to read just real quick this is from Fearsome Creatures of the Lumberwoods. This is from William T. Cox. This was published, I think, in 1904. And I believe this is the first reference to a squonk in writing. So the squonk's range is very limited. Few people outside of Pennsylvania have ever heard of this quaint beast, which is said to be fairly common in the hemlock forests of the state. The squonk is of a very the squonk is of a very retiring disposition, generally traveling about at twilight and dusk. Because of its misfitting skin, which is covered with warts and moles, it is always unhappy. In fact, it is said by people who are best able to judge to be the most morbid of beasts. Hunters who are good at tracking are able to follow the squonk by its tear-stained trail, for the animal weeps constantly. When cornered and an escape seems impossible, or when surprised and frightened, it may even dissolve itself into tears. Squonk hunters are most successful on frosty moonlit nights when the tears are shed slowly and the animal dislikes moving about. It may be heard weeping under the boughs of dark hemlock trees. And Mr. J.P. Wentling, formerly of Pennsylvania and now of St. Anthony Park, Minnesota, had a disappointing experience with a squonk near Mont Alto. He made a clever capture by mimicking the squonk and inducing it to hop into a sack in which he carried it home. When suddenly the burden lightened and the weeping ceased. Wensling unsung the sack and looked in. There was nothing but tears and bubbles.
Another one, fully all in. I'm a big fan of cryptids. I like the concept of them. I love the stories behind them. I heard about the squonk maybe like 5 years ago, and I was like, that's what I want Pennsylvania's cryptid to be. Like, I want something so ugly that it cries all the time. What a weird, fun story that is only in Pennsylvania. And like you kind of brought up, I was in Johnstown for a Squonkapalooza and had an absolute blast. Not only was there so many crying squonks all around, but there were so many fun people that were interested in cryptids and interested in ghost stories and interested in UFO interactions. I had an absolute blast. Love Squonkapalooza.
Well, you will be happy to know that the Wentling tale of Mount Alto, that is just in Franklin County. So this is not a beast unknown in the southern portions of the Commonwealth.
Yeah, once I heard about the squonk, I was all in. Just the idea of it, the
it's just fun.
Yeah, it would sound something like Edward Lear would have written.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's just such a, you don't see a lot of cryptids with very low self-esteem.
Right. And like, I feel bad for it. Like, I want to, like, if I was going to go squonk hunting, it would be to try and find it and be like, you know what, man? I think you look great.
You go out in the woods squonk befriending. Let's be honest.
Yeah, it's just like, how are you doing? You actually look pretty great. I mean, there's way uglier things out there.
Right. Just want to be positive.
At Squonkapalooza, there was a squonk compliment contest, and I love that idea. That's
adorable. You know what? Pennsylvania's pretty cool. Anybody who thinks that we're a little standoffish here, tell them that fact, and people, that's what I want Pennsylvania to be known for.
Yeah, we're awesome. Raystown Lake near Trough Creek State Park has also been the purported home of a Loch Ness-style creature. Can you tell us about Raystown, Ray?
Listen, I'm going to make a bold stance here. And I'm going to tell you a few things. One, I hate lake monsters. I hate them. It's jobberdash. And I'm going to tell you why. I hate them for the same reason I hate sports teams' mascots. There's only a few that are like Gritty, the Flyers. You done an amazing thing. I wasn't prepared to like it as much as I do. You leaned into its unsettling nature that most mascots have. But I think sports mascots are by and large a sad thing. In Altoona, not Altoona, I'm sorry, in Reading, Pennsylvania, there are the Reading Phillies. Now, if you've never been to a baseball game in Reading, do it. I'm going to get back to the Lake Monsters here in a second, but Reading Phillies, that is the ballpark where it is like where mascots go to die. Every single inning has a different mascot. In the seventh inning stretch, they stopped caring. And they had the crazy hot dog vendor, which was a hot dog vendor in Buddy Holly glasses, riding an ostrich, throwing hot dogs and churgers, which is the sandwich du jour at the Reading Phillies game. It is a grilled chicken patty and a hamburger on a bun together. It's beautiful. But yeah, that was it. Oh, and there's a hot tub on the first base foul line. And yes, I definitely saw blood in the hot tub after a foul ball. Reading. Lake monsters. Raystown Lake is a man-made lake. Are they stalking lake monsters? Who's believing this? And of course, one of the large, I think the Pine Matooning Lake, also a man-made lake, believe it or not, up on the straddling the Ohio-Pennsylvania border, also perpetuates to have a lake monster. I just don't want to hear it anymore. If you've got a man-made lake, you don't have a monster. Even if you don't have a man-made lake, can we just let Loch Ness have their thing? They got their thing. And that's nonsense, but
so
let them have it. Stop copying it.
So Mike from Pittsburgh in 2008 would disagree with you, Nick.
I disagree with Mike.
So there was so for those of you who aren't familiar, Raystown is like Nick mentioned, it's like a Loch Ness monster type mascot, for lack of a better term. But that being said, there are still sightings that people have that have kind of perpetuated this over the years. Again, it doesn't make a whole lot of sense when you really think about it, but people are still having these experiences. So I want to share one of those with you all real quick and let you make a determination. So one warm still evening during late August 2008, we decided to drift the boat out offshore to do some night fishing right at the bend of where we camp at the Sonoe sites. Just as it was around the corner from 7 Points. Well, we were using our new fish drawing light, which is a neon green light that would hang down under the boat. Waterproof, of course. Anyway, we're using the light, fishing in the stillest water. It was like black glass. So calm, no breezes, just quiet. Well, about 11:30, 12 p.m., we decided to head back. We were sitting there on the stern, talking and enjoying the calmness of the warm night. All of a sudden, from out in the middle of the lake, there was a whooshing sound. I thought it might be a boat, but there were no lights, no motor sound, just the sound of water swooshing straight towards us. My husband grabbed the spotlight, and about 100 feet from our boat, there was something. It looked like an upside-down canoe rushing through the water at us. He told me, "Grab that fish light now, get it up." I had actually forgotten about it, they say. I grabbed for the rope and started pulling like crazy. But he kept the spotlight on the thing as I grabbed hand over hand, trying to get the underwater light up into the boat. As soon as I got the light up, I turned it off. And I stood there with him watching as this thing got closer. It came within 30 feet of the boat when it went completely under. Where it went, I have no idea. But it left a wake that shook the boat. We rocked enough that it almost pushed us to shore. And I tell you what, we headed back to camp. We sat there at the RV drinking tea and tried to make sense of it. There are no fish in that lake that act like that are native. Not even eels break water like that, and definitely none that big. We know fish in the lake, and we know they can get huge, but nothing like that.
Listen, those fish can get huge. This is a man-made lake. We know everything that's going in this. I mean, are we to believe that this is like a magic xylophone or something?
It's something.
I truly appreciate the hard take.
Right.
Of just that we were like, listen, it's important to listen to everybody and take in what you have to say, and then just a hammer from the sky. Absolutely not.
Listen, I think at some point you have to draw a line somewhere on what you're willing to accept.
Freshwater lake monsters, that's A good place
This
to
is
draw the
my
line.
hill.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, unless you got like an alligator gar. Now, if you've ever had a run-in with an alligator gar,
Right.
I appreciate and I fully understand the terror you felt in that moment.
Well, and I mean, the upper Allegheny people talk about, 7 foot long catfish, at the dam. We have alligator sightings here at the Three Rivers. I mean, they're definitely domestic
They
alligators,
have
but
being
they're still out,
legitimate.
but there's still alligators in the water. People joke about how like, oh, there can't be an alligator in the Mon. And then the DCNR pulls an alligator out of the Mon.
Well,
So
and the Yacht. We
in the
had just
Yock,
a
yep.
flurry of alligator
Yep.
deposits recently.
Oh no, I don't want that to happen. That sounds terrible.
Right. Yeah.
We can't talk about cryptids without bringing up Bigfoot. Do we have any accounts of Bigfoot sightings in Pennsylvania? And do you have any that stand out?
Yeah. So I have a few things actually. So like you said, we can't not talk about Bigfoot. Um, One thing that I want to address, because I see it all the time on Instagram and Facebook, and hopefully the DCNR folks that are listening to this podcast will appreciate this. Anytime you see those DCNR signs talking about recent Bigfoot sightings in the area, those aren't actually from the Rangers. They're not real. Please, please don't bother the poor Rangers about them. Um, but but you see those all over the state. Heck, Kinzu Bridge has calling contests for Bigfoot. Um, it's really popular in the area. And so like not only did I mention the sighting up by Denton Hill, um, but we have them all over the state basically. And they're not always in places um where you'd always expect them. But a lot of these do happen in parks. Um, and there's kind of two main, it's not to get too far in the weeds, but there's kind of two main categories that a lot of Bigfoot sightings kind of fall into, Class A and Class B. Class B are the most common, which is where people hear sounds. And like Nick mentioned earlier, when you hear a fox screaming or a bobcat or a fisher, something like that, we have stuff here in Pennsylvania that makes some really, really wild uh, sounds. Um, but a lot of times people that are hearing these things are used to those things. Um, so the ones that are usually more, at least interesting to us, are the ones that are sightings, where someone actually sees a creature. So one I wanted to talk about, because this actually took place in the Allegheny National Forest, uh, shockingly close to where one of our friends' cabins was at that we stayed the night at once. So this is what I remember reading and just being like, yikes, that's way too close for comfort. Because again, you tell yourself he's not out there, but then when you're in a tent in the middle of the Allegheny National Forest, you start wondering. But so there was a gentleman. This is back in 1997. There was a guy with both of his daughters, and they were staying at a cabin. This is right near Sigel or Sigel, Sigel. I can't remember how you pronounce it. It's right near Clear Creek State Park, right north of there. But so he's on this little back road with both of his daughters on bikes, and he is jogging. And he just says, and this is direct quote, I was jogging down the side of the road with my daughter and her friend, both on a bike. They were on their bikes. I saw what I thought was a person on the road in front of us. As we approached closer, I thought the person was wearing a bulky coat or some kind of hairy coveralls. About 30 yards from the creature, I realized it wasn't a person. Its back was to us. It was looking down at the dirt road while it was walking. Then it turned around and looked at us. It looked to be about 7.5 feet tall, and probably weighed 500 pounds. It had long, sparse red hair. The hair was thicker on its back and shoulder blades. There was no hair on the face. As it turned, it stopped and walked towards us. I turned around, had the girls start riding their bikes down from where we came. I followed on foot, and we never even looked back. About a month prior to the sighting, I heard noises in the woods that I couldn't explain, and then this happens. So a lot of the stories you hear, especially from our area here in Pennsylvania, um, follow similar patterns where people hear weird things and then they have a daylight sighting, or nighttime sighting sometimes. But these sightings are almost never for very long, and they're almost never what you think. If you wanted to have a Bigfoot encounter, a road crossing like we mentioned at Denton Hill, it doesn't sound too bad. You're in a car driving 60 miles an hour. It goes over a few lanes in front of you, and you can be like, oh, I wonder if that was a Bigfoot. What this gentleman had to deal with, especially having a daughter and his daughter's friend with him, that sounds terrifying.
Yeah.
That sounds really scary. And again, when folks are usually reporting these things, because I think people hear that and they go, oh, that's crazy. There's no way that's true. This person's just looking for attention. They must have just misunderstood what they were looking at. You know, like people know what someone in a coat looks like. People know what bears look like. And no one is getting famous for making up these stories. This guy's not getting rich off it. So it's interesting. So when I hear stories like that, those are the ones that kind of stick with me, or the ones that are, short. That's one paragraph. It's not like it's a whole novel. It's just a weird thing that happened to a guy once after hearing some weird things in the woods at a cabin.
Yeah, I think Bigfoot seems the most realistic always in my mind, just because of the creatures that have existed in the past and the fact that we don't know everything everywhere. It just seems, and also the iconography is just so fun.
Right.
There's so much fun stuff that you can buy and believe, and it doesn't really, at least to my understanding, there's no real like violent Bigfoot stories as much as there's like encounters, like, oh, they saw something or they heard something.
Right. No, there are some pretty crazy encounters out there, and there are obviously some pretty out there theories. But I think, like you're saying, Christian, a lot of people look at the Bigfoot archetype as like a symbol of the wild. And I think definitely in the northern tier of Pennsylvania, and I mean other places, when people have that clip art cutout of the Bigfoot throwing up the peace sign, cut out of cardboard next to their cabin, like it's almost like a nod that like you're in a wild place at this time.
Can I ask you? So I'm a giant cryptids fan. I have stickers, I have books, I've definitely read a lot about them. What's your favorite cryptid? Can't be Squonk. I mean, take Squonk out of the running. Is it Mothman in West Virginia? Is it Jersey Devil? What do you guys like?
Well, I'm going to say Jersey Devil no, because we know the real origins of that. Ben Franklin could hold a grudge, and that's hilarious that somehow a funny joke got transferred into something that people believe is a real cryptid. I'm not. I do kind of I think I have to go with Mothman because it's so singular. It has a lot of elements like the red eye stuff, but it's just, again, you talk about iconography of Bigfoot, which has been with us for so long, it's almost primordial. That, and I think that's why it's easier for us to accept as potentially real. It's between Mothman and Wampus cats.
Wampus cats are great. Um, I'm I would normally I would say Mothman because again he probably is my favorite, but what I'm going to go with tonight, because we're talking about Pennsylvania, I'm going to talk about the Alba Twitch. So the Alba Twitch, and this is one of those things where people think like, oh, how much weird stuff can there be out there in Pennsylvania? The Alba Twitch is what many people think to be a version of a Bigfoot, but not Bigfoot. They're typically about 4 feet tall. So they're still hair covered, and a lot of the lore around them is actually closer to fairy lore that comes out of Ireland as far as how they interact and what they do. But they're generally located around the Chickees Rock region in York County.
In Lancaster County.
It should be Lancaster County, yes. Like, so it's a very small area that these things are supposed to inhabit. And it's one of those things that sounds crazy and it sounds out there, but you have tons of stories out there of just normal people hiking, walking their dogs, and having these really strange encounters. To the point now where there's actually an Alba Twitch festival, I think in Columbia or Columbiana. But that's probably my favorite because it's so like hyper specific and it ticks a lot of those boxes, but has some weird stuff that goes along with it too. Like they're supposed to be able to like phase in and out. They're supposed to be able to just pop in and out of existence almost, but they really like apples. And I really like apples too. So
In much the same reason why you said I am going to have to retract my previous statement of Mothman and Wampus cats, because that I believe it's a Lenape, which is also known as the Delaware, have the hide behind, which, yeah, I see how
It's so
excited you
good.
are,
It's
Brendan.
so
I brought
good.
up so very briefly, and again, I believe it's comes from the Lenape's lore. There is when parties would go out, they would put the least sure, the least confident person in the back of the line, and they would say that, hey, whatever you do, keep your eyes up front because the hide behind could creep up on you. And if you turn and face it, it'll get you. It'll get you. And the image of the hide behind has been further codified by the M. Night Shyamalan movie, The Village. If you recall
Hmm.
the creatures in the woods, those were, it is my understanding, very much
Hmm.
modeled after the hide behinds of Lenape lore. So I think that might have to be mine because I don't know why people slag on The Village. I enjoyed the
I think
movie.
it's a great movie. Yeah, but the High Behind's fantastic. I can't argue with that. That's a great choice, Nick.
We got a lot of ones here. So I mean, pick and choose. Don't let it be Raystown Ray. Apparently.
Right.
So help you if I even hear you whispering in your room after lights out about Ray Sound Ray.
So moving on from cryptids to something a little bit more out of this world, there was a legendary UFO sighting that took place in Forbes State Forest in the 1960s. Can you tell us about the Kecksburg UFO incident?
Well, I guess I'll take a run at it. I mean, basically, this is really as the Cold War is heating up. I believe it was only maybe it was as many as 12 years ago that all this information was actually declassified. So you can look into it, but in the time between it's being fully revealed what was going on, it really was. We've been misled to a degree to believe that Roswell was quite the fractured point that it was. Apparently, Roswell was not a very well-known happening until I think the early 70s, if my understanding is led to be true. However, Kecksburg was very well known because you had radio stations covering what was going on. But yes, something did crash land in the Kecksburg area, and of course it ignited a lot of people's interest in what was going on in the sky. Most famously, regionally, would be the author Stan Gordon, and anybody that gets into Bigfoot and UFO are probably already familiar with him. And if you happen not to be, you should change that.
Yeah. And like the reason that it caught people's attention for so long is because like Nick mentioned, there wasn't like there was UFO lore in like the zeitgeist, but it's not like everyone knew about Roswell at the time. So there wasn't like this template for UFO crashes, which gives a lot of the coverage that happened right away. That's why it's kind of so spooky and kind of creepy. So what you have is you have one night, you have a fireball going over all these counties and seen by tens of thousands of people, um, and crashing just outside of Kecksburg. Um, and people said that it made what looked like controlled movements before landing or crashing, and you have all these folks they're going out to the countryside and seeing the crash site. So like it's one of those instances where like, nope, there was a thing that definitely crashed. This isn't like that's not necessarily up for debate, which makes it so interesting in UFO lore because usually it's just, oh, some people saw a weird thing in the sky. With Kecksburg, you'd be like, nope, that's where it hit, and you have people that were from the radio stations and people in the community saying that um, when they went to go check the crash site, because like most good people, the first thought is, okay, well, if that's a crash, there may be people that need help. So folks go over there. And what they see is an acorn shaped craft that they said had what looked like strange writing on it, that they weren't able to recognize. And these are police officers, newspaper reporters, radio people, a mechanic. So again, people from all different walks of life seeing this thing. Shortly thereafter, the authorities show up. I believe the Air Force reportedly showed up and took whatever it was away on a flatbed. So there was definitely like a thing that happened. Um, and everyone was like, this is a UFO. This is how it starts, you know. And it just kind of blew up from there, and really at that point became part of like local lore. And especially in the Chestnut Ridge area, you have, you know, being one of the Laurel Highlands, you know, you have a lot of open space out there, and you have a lot of um, people that do report a lot of strange lights. So that place was very ripe for an incident like this to kind of get caught up with everyone. So it's one of those things where it tells us a lot about our society at the time, like Nick mentioned, it being the Cold War, um, and how kind of ready people were to believe like, oh, this is a UFO, not like, you know, a piece of foreign technology or something like that. Like that's where everyone went first.
So, what have we been learning about the incident since things have been released?
Yeah, it's so I was trying to figure out it is believed that it was maybe a Cosmos 96 spacecraft. It was just something to launch a satellite, is my
Mm-hmm.
understanding, or a General Electric Mark II re-entry bit that had come down. NASA today has come out fully and dismissed any claims that it was a Soviet thing. It
Mm-hmm.
was definitely
Ours.
our tech,
Yeah.
and that fireball was seen over Lake Erie and over Pittsburgh, and so it had been tracked. So I believe all that came out in 2008. Now that
Mm-hmm.
I'm quickly trying to
Yeah.
gather information, but it's fully declassified. However, there will always be some room for speculation
Mm-hmm.
because so many of the records were lost into intervening years. This occurred in 1965.
Mm-hmm.
Can you tell us about the folklore around the supposed lost Union gold in Elk
Oh
State
my
Forest?
goodness. This is you wanted to hear me talk about lake monsters again? Okay. I will. No. Here's the thing to understand. Okay. We have our official First State folklorist is a man named Henry Shoemaker, of which there was recently a book came out. I don't have it yet. I think it's titled Henry Shoemaker, the Scoundrel of the Susquehannas, because he is not very well regarded by folklorists because he was responsible for creating a lot of folk tales whole cloth. He claims that some of his earlier stories were may not be true, but they were legitimately what he had gathered from conversations with people. I don't know what to believe, but I do recommend his Pennsylvania Mountain Stories. It's a good read. So he um, had in one of his early books actually wrote about a pirate named Blackbeard, not the historical Edward Teach, but another Blackbeard pirate that came into Baltimore with gold, 40 bars of gold, something like that. And he commissioned two wagons with false bottoms, and they went up and they end up in the Ridgeway, Pennsylvania area,
St.
where
Mary's. Yeah.
St. Mary's
Yep.
Ridgeway area, sometimes dense run, that general area. And they're ambushed and they have to bury the gold, and one person gets back, one person knows where it's at, one person has found something to that effect. Well, that I know is in a Shoemaker book because I have it on the shelf behind me. Later on, it becomes lost Union gold. There's a Colonel Littleton. They have to go the circuitous route up through northern Pennsylvania. They're ambushed by Copperheads, which are Confederate sympathizers in the North. This story has all the exact same elements, same amount of gold, same false bottom wagons. It is clearly, to me, the same story, just with different names. There is no historical evidence of a Colonel Littleton. There is nothing in the historical record to suggest this ever happened. But the people that believe in it are further encouraged because just a few years ago, the FBI did a dig at the behest of some things that were dug up by a group of treasure hunters based in DuBois, Pennsylvania, over in Clearfield, Jefferson County area. So I am very firm in my statement that, like, hey, if you dig through the folklore, you'll see that this story's been around in very different forms. It's it and there's nothing from the historical record to even give any further credence that this is a plausible story.
Absolutely. But you have pirates, you have lost Union gold, you have copperheads, you have, the north central Pennsylvania wilds. You can forgive treasure hunters for being intrigued by that story. And I think that's what kind of gets people over the years. Yeah, if you do any real research into it, you're like, oh, this definitely didn't really happen. But you have enough people that said like, oh, my grandfather knew a guy that said he had one of the pieces of gold in a coffee bean bag under his bed, and then like, you're out treasure hunting and stuff. And we do have gold here in Pennsylvania. You can pan for gold in a lot of our streams, and it is there, but there's not 52 bars of stamped Ulysses S. Grant gold.
And no amount of wanting it to be real is
Right.
going to produce that gold in your pocket.
Right, but if you're someone who is into that kind of stuff, and you need a good excuse to get out and do a little bit of prospecting, in our state forests, I don't
I
know,
can just
sounds a little bit better, doesn't
I can
it?
just imagine the domestic conversations like, no, 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 honey, I'm really doing this for us. I'm going to find that gold, and when I do, you'll say, why are you you'll stop saying, why are you spending another weekend by yourself in the woods?
Right,
Sweetheart, I'm doing this for us, for our future, for our
This is
future
bigger than
children.
me.
Well, what did Twain say? Never let the truth get in the way of a good story.
that's yeah,
Yeah,
yeah.
sure.
That's you can apply that to a lot of this, and
Yeah.
I think it still counts. I think it still counts.
Why do you think people going out and exploring these sorts of folklores and legends is a good thing?
So again, I think that anything that helps us connect to nature, the wild places around us, our past, our culture, um, anything that makes you legitimately curious. If there's something that actually legitimately piques your interest and gets you excited, then these are things that are worth pursuing. It gets people out into these wild areas. It makes them ask those questions of like, oh, well, what is really going on? You know, and I think what it also does is it brings people together. Like me and Nick are fly fishermen. I do a lot of birding. We all hike. Um, if looking for these things and doing a little bit of legend tripping or just being curious can get you to interact with more people in these areas, that helps you learn about the people around you and it takes you to new places. There's been, even just us, we've gone on not investigations, but gone to see what's up someplace because of a weird story we've heard. In some of those places we maybe wouldn't have gone otherwise. And we certainly looked at them with a different perspective than what we may have otherwise. And I think that's why that's why I think this stuff is so important.
And to kind of circle back to what I said at the very beginning of our conversation this evening is that I do think these stories foster a love of history. They can foster a love of inquiry and reading. I know too often I visit a place and I want to learn more about it, and I start digging and I start talking to people and trying to find any written word on the subject and digging back into the history. And again, I think there's a type of person that's predisposed to history that then gets into this. And I think there's a type of person that the trigger point, the navel, is the mystery. And then they go into that. So we know just psychologically the benefits of walking, and the benefits particularly of walking not in a man-made space. It is real and it is tangible. And we also know the benefits of camaraderie and of inquiry and kind of an appreciation of time. And I think that these in the best used in the best ways go to that. And I think in the worst ways, they breed callous and crass commercialism.
Absolutely.
What's the purpose of folklore, and why is it important that we learn about it?
Folklore is in a way us telling stories about ourselves. Folklore is a way of us to impart values without lecturing to one another. It is a way to impart values in a way that makes people decipher them, makes people work them out in their own. It gets you to flex your head. It's a way of establishing an identity, not just of a people, but of a region. It's about it is about history. It's about people. It is we have been telling ourselves stories since before we had begun agriculture. We have universal symbols that relate directly to storytelling. So in that way, storytelling is as critical to our survival because it's one of those things, it's the vine that binds us.
Is there anything you're working on for the podcast right now that you're excited about? Any topics?
So we have a few interviews lined up. We've been on a bit of a kick interviewing authors. And I'm actually, I have 3 books that I'm working through right now that Nick will be working through afterwards to prepare for some interviews. And it's fun because we get to talk to people from all different walks of life, from all different interests. And that's kind of like the fun thing about doing a podcast, as you know, Christian, is just getting to talk to new people. And anytime you can sit down with someone who is an expert on like a hyper specific topic, that could be a lot of fun. So we have a few of those in the works. We have a few kind of on-site not investigations, but just kind of things we want to go look at that we're hopefully going to get to this fall. And plus just our normal, just kind of like spooky fun stories. So
where can people listen to the Ghost Furnace podcast?
Yeah, so you guys, everyone out there can find us on Instagram, Facebook, YouTube, really anywhere that you listen to podcasts, Apple Podcasts, Prime, any of those places. And if you have thoughts and if you have stories you want to share with us, you can find us on those locations, or you can just email us at theghostfurnacepodcast@gmail.com.
Guys, thanks so much for talking to us. We really appreciate it.
Hey, really enjoyed the conversation. And it's unfortunately the people that know us too well have heard so many of these stories for us that they usually tell us to just calm down. So it was nice to get all these out.
Yeah, this is fantastic. Thanks so much, Christian.
I want to thank my guests, Brendan Perry and Nick Pennsylvania, for joining the podcast. Be sure to follow us on Instagram and Meta for more information about upcoming episodes. You can support the podcast by buying merch at hemlockstohellbenders.com, or you can click support this show in the podcast description to provide a monthly donation. If you're a Pennsylvania business interested in advertising with the podcast, email us at hemlockstohellbenders@gmail.com. This has been Hemlocks to Hellbenders. I'll see you out there. Hosting, production, and editing by Christian Alexanderson. Music by John Sauer. Graphics by Matt Davis.